Hi, I'm Preston Williams, and welcome to another edition of Jazz Talk. Today on our show, we have with us one of the greatest bass players of all time. This gentleman has been on the scene for over 45 years and has worked with many greats from the Pointer Sisters to David Sanborn, John McLaughlin, so many, Joan Osborne, the Gil Evans Orchestra, and for 4 years, he was an integral part of the legendary band, the Pat Metheny Group. It is a pleasure to have him on today. Please welcome Mr. Mark Egan. Welcome, sir.
Welcome. Thank you, Preston. Thanks for having me. Hi,
Yeah.
everybody out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, Mark, as I said, you've been on the scene for a long time. You've played in so many different bands with different artists. And I'm interested in knowing more about your humble beginnings. I understand that you're from Brockton, Massachusetts.
I'm from Brockton, Mass, which is
Yeah.
35 miles southeast of Boston.
You know, the first thing that comes to mind are two famous boxers, Rocky Marciano and Marvin Hagler. They both come out of that area. And yeah, interested to know about your background, man. One of the things that I found interesting is that you are originally a trumpet player. You found bass much later on, like in your teens, but you're a trumpet player, man. Tell us about that and how you got involved in music.
Yes. Well, first of all, my mother went to school with Rocky Marciano.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Rocky went to Brockton High. But it was... my original instrument was guitar when I was in the 3rd grade, and then I did that for a little bit, but then I got interested in trumpet in the 4th grade. I played all through, took private lessons and played in the elementary school bands and the junior high school band and the high school bands, and played in a lot of bands, jazz bands around the Brockton area and Boston area. I played with the Brockton Youth Stage Band. It's funny because it was such a big deal then. There were high school kids playing in this big band, and we did a lot of just stock charts, but it was a good opportunity to play out. We played at Expo 67. That was, the World's Fair. So, yes, I did. Trumpet was my first instrument. And
Interesting. So I guess when you were in your teens, you started playing around with the bass a little bit. What made you go to the bass?
Well, I always loved bass, and I always picked out bass notes. And that was in the 60s, mid-60s. So at the time on the radio, if you think what was on pop radio or rock radio, it was Jimi Hendrix and Cream and Beatles and Motown, the great bass player James Jamerson. So even though I was a trumpet player and playing more in the high end of the sonic spectrum, because trumpets, you think of it as sonically higher, I was listening to bass notes and picking them out when I would listen to the radio. So
interesting.
I was so into it, so much so that I took it upon myself to buy a bass. I bought a Del Rey bass for $40, I think, and got a bass amp. And I took some lessons with a great guitar player, Mike Lally, who was local in Brockton. And he put me right in the right places of playing scales, using all 4 fingers on the bass of electric bass, because it is bass guitar, so I approached it in that way. So it was a good beginning of that. And I just listened to records and did it for the fun of it. I was really a serious trumpet player, and I actually went to the University of Miami to study music as a trumpet player, but I brought my bass with me.
I was about to ask you about that. I guess somewhere along the line, as you were studying, you made that decision to switch to bass. But during that time period, you met a lot of people. I mean, Jaco Pastorius was there, Pat Metheny. I've had Bobby Watson, Carmen Lundy. They've all been on the show. And Randy Burnson, guitarist, he's been on too. But tell me, what happened when you were in college? Like, you know what? I think I want to just go for the bass now. You stopped with the trumpet. Why?
Well, first of all, I went down there because it was a great jazz school that was directed by the great Jerry Coker, who's an amazing jazz educator. And he attracted a lot of great players: Pat Metheny, Danny Gottlieb, Clifford Carter, Hiram Bullock, all the other people that you mentioned. Mark Colby was there. And so when I went down there, up to that point, I had listened to Chet Baker and as far as trumpet players, Maynard Ferguson, but when I got there, my mind was really opened up to the whole lineage of jazz by being around such heavy people down there. So I started to really investigate and go backwards from that point in time and check out the lineage of jazz. And so it was really an explosion, because that was 1969, and the music that was happening at that time. Miles was playing Bitches Brew and
Oh yeah.
with those bands, but then you had the Bill Evans Trio with Eddie Gomez, and so there was a really explosion of music. So my mind was really opened up musically when I got there. And I was still a hardcore trumpet player and really listened to Miles and Clifford Brown and all the great jazz players, trumpet players. But I also brought, as I said, brought my bass. And for the first, I would say, year and a half there, I wasn't really playing that much bass. I was playing mostly trumpet in bands and playing gigs locally. But I got asked to play with this saxophone player named Jet Nero, who wasn't associated with the university, but had always had a steady gig around Miami area. And there was a lot of work in Miami then. There were a lot of clubs and music was everywhere. And he had heard, because my roommate had told him that I played bass, he called me to do a gig at a club. And so it was actually one of the first gigs that I ever did. I had been a professional trumpet player since I was 15, so I was used to playing standards and improvising and et cetera. But on bass, I was just jamming basically. But he called me and you know, I'm the type of person, I go for it, you know. So he said, could you play a gig tonight? And I said, okay, on bass, you know. And I said, what tunes you're doing? And I knew all the standards, but I hadn't played them on bass. So that day I practiced all day and I went and did the gig and it became a steady gig. So that's how I first got into it. And I just took a chance. And I was playing basically one finger bass on each hand, you know, very, very limited technique, but I had a good feel. And I had a good sensibility for playing what notes to play, you know, it's harmonically. Again, I was a serious trumpet player. So that was the starting of it. And then I became very busy in demand on bass as much as I was on trumpet until it got to a point where actually I was playing more bass than I was trumpet. And it was a very difficult time in a lot of ways for me because I didn't want to lose what I had on trumpet, but I didn't want to lose what I could get on bass. So I finally made a real heartfelt decision, soulful decision to go with bass. And I went straight ahead, and trumpet became a secondary instrument, which is a big deal, you know, ego-wise, when you think of yourself as a certain type of instrumentalist, and then all of a sudden you sort of change it up. But that's the only way that I could really do things because I like to really go full force with it. And I couldn't do both of them. So that's what I did. And I took lessons with a great bass player down there, Don Kaufman, who later taught at the university. And I started doing gigs, and then that was the beginning of it. And I remember just feeling that I was self-realized as a bass player, and that's what I wanted to do. I was just driven to do it, and you know, practicing 8 hours a day, and jamming, and writing, and playing at night. So that was the beginnings of it for me.
That's great. Now, Mark, how did you meet Jaco Pastorius, the late great Jaco Pastorius?
Yeah, Jaco. I met him about 3 years after I had been there. That wasn't my earliest influence there.
Gotcha.
He was playing with a group with Ira Sullivan, the great instrumentalist jazz player, who, if any of the listeners out there don't know of Ira Sullivan, you should check about him. He recently passed away, but he was an amazing trumpet player, saxophone player, flute, just an amazing musician. But I had been playing in his band, playing upright bass at the time. I started to play acoustic, and he told me about this young player, Jaco, who actually we're the same age, was up in Fort Lauderdale. I was down in Miami, and he was also playing an electric band with Jaco, and he told me about him. So I started hearing about Jaco, and then finally got to meet him. And one summer, shortly after that, he was teaching at the university a summer workshop, private lessons, and that's when I actually got to study with him and really go in deep on what he was into. And I tell you, that was, you know, I really felt, and I can remember vividly those lessons, that I was in the presence of an innovator. You know, it's very unusual that you're in that presence with someone when you're studying a lesson, that you're with an actual innovator. And he was that, and he was very strong, and he was a really sweet man, very driven, as everyone knows. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stories by many people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And at the time that I met him, Jaco was extremely straight, wasn't doing any drugs or drinking or anything, and he was just into the music, and it was pure Jaco. And I was lucky to be around him as well as the other players and bass players that got to hang and study with him there.
Yeah, Hiram Bullock and others, tell stories how he was, and even Pat Metheny says, when you listen to Jaco with Weather Report, and later on, he said he was actually way better before he got with Weather Report. And when he hears these stories about, what happened to Jaco toward the end, he said they don't line up with the guy that I knew. He was clean, he didn't do drugs, didn't drink or anything like that. But what was it about, you talk about innovator, Mark, what was it about his playing that really, really just made you perk up and like, wow? Because of course, all that came to fruition when he put out that his self-titled recording went in '76 and just blew everyone's mind. I've talked to bass players over the years, and including Marcus Miller, who said, when we heard Portrait of Tracy and some of the other songs, we were like, what is that, two bass players, or what is that? What is he doing? It just blew everyone's mind. But I guess you got a taste of that early on when you spent time with them up close.
I did, and I heard him especially with Ira Sullivan's band with Alex Starkey and Bobby Conomo. That was the band, and it was magical music, and he was doing things that people weren't doing on bass. Now people take it for granted when you hear harmonics or
right.
double stops, and not that people hadn't played those things before on acoustic bass or electric bass, but Jaco not only could play it with virtuosity, but he was a great composer, and conceptually, the way that he worked with those different elements of the bass that no one had done before was the way that he brought it into a legendary way that no one had ever heard. So, and it was, when you heard it, it was like nothing you'd ever heard before, because he had the sound, the fretless sound. He pulled the frets off. Not that there weren't fretless basses before them, but no one really explored it and realized and wrote songs with harmonics. That was the first time they had done that. And, his technique was flawless. But it's the groove that he played with it, and the way and the sensibilities harmonically that he played. He's just such a musical person, and when he played piano, he could play great chords and harmony. So he had it, he had the whole thing in his head, and he was able to translate it into a sound and an instrument that no one had ever done before. So that was very legendary, very influential to everyone, so many people. So I was lucky to be around that in the formative years with him. After leaving a lesson with him, I'd play 8 hours a day, and realized that there's so many ways to approach a melody, especially on fretless, where you can, the way that you can embellish a melody, you can come from below a little bit, above it, and all of those things. And he really brought that to the fore in a beautiful way. He played so melodically. But he could also play really intensely, but it wasn't just chops. It wasn't just technique. Now there are many players that on the planet that are virtuosos. I'm sure you hear them. And
Victor Wooten is one of them. Yeah.
Yes, and many, many players. And Victor's a fantastic player. He's just a virtuoso, and he took it in a whole nother direction as well. But a lot of people, I go to the NAMM show, which unfortunately won't happen this year because of the COVID situation. But if anyone ever gets to go there, you'll hear what I'm talking about, where it's just a huge auditorium, a conference center, and there's players with ridiculous technique that I will never have. Probably, I'm trying to get better and better all the time, but a lot of these players lack what Jaco had, which was this purity of the music and playing it, no wasted notes. It wasn't jive notes. It was really making a statement with it, and that's something that I aspire to, and I think so many people aspire to. And you hear great guitarists that are like that, and on any instrumentalist, you can tell when people are just playing a bunch of notes, and people are really getting to the center of it and really making a statement. And a lot of that, for me, goes back to Miles Davis and to the center of his core and his expression, and how he never really overplayed, and it was always just the right thing for the right moment. And maybe he would play a phrase, but he wouldn't finish the phrase and let your imagination finish it for him, So it's players like that I really aspire to as well.
Yeah. Now, Mark, you also studied, just mentioned earlier, you studied with Dave Holland as well, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Man,
Which
what was that like?
was a great experience. When I first moved to New York, I came with Phyllis Hyman, great singer, and in that group was Hiram Bullock, Clifford Carter, and Billy Bowker. And we played with that group, and then for about a month in New York, and then I got asked to go out on the road with the Pointer Sisters, and that lasted about a month. And then I came back to New York, and I didn't have any work. So I said, you know what? I'm in New York. I don't have any gigs right now, but I want to study because I'm in the city. Who do I want to study with? And Dave Holland was one of my
Mm,
idols from the modern groups with Miles Davis. So I
right.
took some lessons with Dave, and that was fantastic on acoustic bass. And he really got down to the basics of creating a good sound and different, ways of getting around the bass through playing scales, arpeggios, and then improvising over songs. And we would play the tune Solar. We would play duo, which was amazing, playing in front of Dave Holland and playing it, but we traded, and he would give me ideas, and it was very inspiring. I
Oh,
didn't
man.
study with him that long, but what I did study with him was enough to get me going, and he's one of my favorites on acoustic bass among many.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I guess not long after you come out of college, you start working, man, and you hooked up, you play with the Pointer Sisters. What was that like, and how did you even get involved? It's just interesting. It doesn't seem like Mark Egan playing with the Pointer Sisters, but okay. How'd you hook up with them?
Well, in Miami, while I was going to school, on Miami Beach, there were many hotels that had national acts shows that came in every week, and they needed a big band or a group to back them up because they would come with either a pianist or a conductor.
Yeah,
So every week I was in a band at one of those hotels that was contracted by a great trombone player and contractor, Peter Graves.
Peter
And
Graves.
he
Yeah,
would draw from the musicians at the university that were playing in the top bands at the university. I was one of them. So we always worked. I was working 7 nights a week while I was going to school, and I really cut my teeth on playing shows. And a lot of these great people, that came into town, a lot of the South Philly people like Bobby Vinton, um, Frankie Avalon,
oh wow,
Bobby
those are names I haven't
Randall,
heard in a while.
and you had one rehearsal like on a Sunday, I think, or a Monday, and then you hit the show that day, that night, and all week. So you really had to get your reading together and your groove together and learn, how that whole thing works. So I cut my teeth in that. So then when I was in New York, after we had been with Phyllis Hyman, again, Peter Graves, that same um, contractor, contacted us, the rhythm section, and asked if we wanted to go out with the Pointer Sisters. And so that's how that happened. So it's connections, but it was from someone who I'd worked with before, who knew my playing. And so it wasn't just a cold call of someone
Right.
auditioning. So we just went and did it. And I came back from that. And then I got a call from Deodato, the great Brazilian pianist
Yeah.
and composer. And he called me because Jeff Berlin, the great Jeff Berlin bass player, had recommended me for his gig. So Deodato called me and he said, well, who have you played with? And I said, well, I just got off the road with the Pointer Sisters. He said, okay, do you want to go to Australia for a month? So, without hearing me. So it was because I had that credential that it went to the next. And so things kept unfolding like that for me.
Great, great. And also you played with David Sanborn too early on.
Yes, and that was the next big band for me, was playing with Dave Sanborn, which was a great, great experience, which Hiram Bullock, who I'd played with Phyllis, had recommended me for that. And I'd also been, I'm going to have a little sip of water here.
Sure, take your time, man.
But by that time, I was sort of getting into the New York session scene, as well as players. So my name had gotten around, and Hiram was at the time playing with David Sanborn, and I'd been playing with the drummer Victor Lewis, great drummer,
Mm.
one of my favorites.
Oh, I like Victor. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so we did that, and we recorded "Promise Me the Moon" is the name of the record with David on Warner Brothers. About a month or two after I joined the band, we recorded that, and Dave asked me if I had any songs that I could contribute, and I had a song called "Heart Lake," and that was the first song So it was a big deal, you know, a song on a David Sanborn record on a Warner
Yeah.
Brothers record label, you know?
That's great, Mark. That's great. Now, I wanted to ask you your connection with Pat. Did you meet Pat Metheny during the time when you were at University of Miami? Or did that come later? Because I know in, I guess, 77, you hooked up with the Pat Metheny group, you and your good friend, Danny Gottlieb. And you guys, I think, were roommates in school, weren't you? You and Danny.
Well, Danny and I weren't roommates, but we played together all the time, and we were pals. And we
Okay.
actually, around that time, were on the road with the great comedian George Gobel.
Okay.
And George would go out with a trio, a jazz trio, and we would basically play him on and play him off and play one or two songs with him. So Danny and I had done that, and also played many of the shows on Miami Beach together.
Okay.
But Pat came to the university, I think in 72 or 73, and that's where I met Pat.
Okay.
And he came as a student, and I'll never forget when he came in and sat in with the big band, and I was watching it, and I said, wow, this guy he's a professional. He's completely formed his style. He had been heavily influenced by Wes Montgomery, and
That's his guy.
He had it. It was solid, and he was just off to the races with his style and everything. So we did play at the University of Miami. He didn't stay very long because he got an offer to teach at Berkeley with Gary Burton in
Mm-hmm.
Gary Burton's band. So he left for that, and I stayed in Miami. So it was a few years later in '75 that I met him up in Boston. And then when I moved to New York in '76, we had stayed in touch. And he wanted to put the band together and asked me if I'd come up to Boston to rehearse and just get a feel for the band. So that was with Danny and Lyle and myself. That was the band.
Oh man, that was great. And of course, speaking of Lyle, we just lost him earlier this year. What a genius! Who was very important in the Pat Metheny group. But that was actually the first time I think I heard you, Mark. And as soon as I heard, I was like, "Who is this bass player?" Because of your tone, you had such a beautiful tone. You didn't sound like anyone else. And just some of those early records that you guys did, like "Phase Dance," was one of my favorites. Man, I love that song. And but like I said, yeah, you guys were together for a few years, and I guess in '81, you and Danny formed Elements. Why did you guys leave, or what was the reason for you guys just wanted to do your own thing or start a new band?
Yes, well, I had done the band for 4 years, and we did two records. The first album, which is sometimes called the White Album, with a
Right.
on it, and then American Garage.
Mhm.
And after the end of 4 years, I was getting a lot of work in New York, and actually, I had a conflict. I was asked to go out on the road with Carly Simon, and Pat had a tour, but a rehearsal, but we weren't sure when it was going to start. So Pat wanted to make a change, and I wanted to make a change. He wanted to have acoustic bass, and I was back in New York doing the studio work and playing with people and touring. So that's when I left and started to get back into doing the studio work that I had been doing when I was with David Sanborn 4 years earlier.
Mm.
And I actually continued doing that work while I was on the road with Pat. Whenever I was off we were never off for that very long. We were on the road about 300 days a year for 4 years, which is
It's incredible.
very intense, it was a great experience. But when I did have a week off or a couple weeks off, I would get in touch with contractors in New York, and I would do records and record dates for various things, for jingles and things like that. But when I got back, I was back on the New York studio scene, and I wanted to do a record, and Danny was just finishing up with Pat, and we decided to do the Elements group because Danny and I have a real deep rapport as a rhythm section team. So
Yeah.
we did that first record, and that was the one that started. We have done 6 or 8 records, I think, since.
Yeah, some really good stuff, man. And I can definitely tell you guys have a good rapport. It's interesting. I've talked to so many people over the years, and people says, "Man, I love all of Pat Metheny's stuff." He says, "But that first band that they had with Danny and Mark Egan, that's like my favorite." They like the early recordings. But as I said, man, you guys did some fantastic stuff, and you work with other artists. You play with Stan Getz, man. What was that like working with Stan Getz?
That was 1981. That was a great experience. It was with the great late Chuck Loeb, I have to say. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And Mitch Foreman, Victor Lewis, and Bobby Thomas playing percussion, who used to be with Weather Report. And
Hmm.
great. We did a lot of more contemporary music that was written by Chuck and Mitch. And we did some standards with Stan. And, again, I was in the presence of a master. He's an icon, Stan. And Stan never let you down. Stan always sounded incredible every night, no matter how tired we were from traveling on the bus all over Italy or France. He always sounded great, and he's one of the great saxophone players, one of the great innovators on saxophone. When you hear Stan Getz, you know it's Stan.
Yeah.
He was like that every night. It was incredible. I've never been around someone who was just so much their sound, so focused,
Hmm. Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, and also, no, I was thinking about some other people that you work with, Duran Duran. Man, what was it like working with a group like that? You know?
Yeah, that was in 1985, and it was actually a project of three of the players with Duran Duran. It was Simon Le Bon and Nick Rhodes and Roger Taylor, the drummer.
Okay.
Yeah, at that time with Duran Duran, two of the other players in Duran Duran did Power Station, that band, and it was Robert. Can't think of his last name. I was going to say Robert Plant, but it's not that. Robert Palmer, is that his name? Anyway, he was the singer with that band, and the other three guys in the band wanted to do another solo project, sort of, and that was called Arcadia. And they were looking for other players, a bass player and other guitar players to play in that band. And the producer, Alex Sadkin, who coincidentally used to play in a band with Jaco in the very early years, he played saxophone. He later went on to be a recording engineer at Criteria Studios in Miami.
Hmm.
And we used to go in when I was in Miami and record late at night. We would get free studio time on weekends. And we would go in with Hiram Bullock and Clifford and basically the rhythm section with Phyllis Hyman. And we would record all night. And that's how I met Alex. He was an assistant engineer. He later became a producer and later went on to produce Simply Red. He produced Grace Jones, and he produced most of the Duran Duran records.
Oh,
So
wow.
he was a friend of mine, and I was doing some session work in New York. He was recording Foreigner, and he was working on the hit "I Want to Know What Love Is." I want to
Oh,
know what love
everyone knows
is.
that song. Oh, yeah.
Such a great song.
Yeah.
When it goes to the bridge, the chorus on that is just so strong. But Alex was in the same studio. I was recording in the other Studio B at Right Track Studios in New York, and I saw Alex outside, and he said, "Hey, Mark," and he said, Duran Duran guys are doing a record. Would you be interested? I'll recommend you. And I said, absolutely. So I was recording Elements in the other room. That's a funny thing.
Yeah.
And so one thing led to another, and we went they asked me to play with them. So I went to Europe for a month, to France, and we recorded for a month and did all those tracks. Also, they recommended a drummer. I recommended a drummer, Steve Jordan.
Mm.
Alex said they also wanted an additional drummer, so Steve and I went over. So that was a great experience. And I recently did an interview. It was a group interview with all the players that they could contact about the Arcadia project. It was a very creative project. For people who haven't heard it, it's called Arcadia, So Red the Rose, and it's not your typical Duran Duran record at all. I mean, it has pop elements in it, but it also has a lot of interesting grooves and a lot of openness. And they let me do whatever on that, and so I would try.
I got to listen to that. I got to listen to that, Mark. I mean, if you're involved in it, I know it's got to be something real special. So
It was good. It was a great project. So I've obviously I come from the '60s, and I'm a baby boomer. So I have a lot of influences from a lot of different directions, from jazz and rock and pop and avant-garde jazz and Indian music and
oh
classical
yeah.
music. And, I'm not. The only way that I'm a purist is that I'm pure in all of them. I try to go for the source and the center of each one of those styles. But so I'm open to many different things, and I've done a lot of different type of music, from that to Joan Osborne to playing,
Yeah.
with the Gil Evans Orchestra, and
I was about to ask you about that, man. How did you hook up with Gil Evans Orchestra?
it's a similar thing. In New York, there was a club called the 55 Grand, and it was a
Oh
club
yeah.
in Soho, and there were we'd always play there with different bands with Hiram and Victor Lewis and Mike Stern. Jaco was hanging out there, and Gil Evans would come in from time to time. And I think Gil had heard of me through Pat Metheny, and he called me one time to do a tour with the Gil Evans Orchestra, but I was on tour with Pat. So again, I was getting a lot of conflicts of being asked to do other things besides the Pat Metheny group. So anyway, I was not with the Pat Metheny group, and Gil asked me to play with the band in 1983. We played every Monday night at a club called Sweet Basil. I don't know if you remember that club.
Oh, I'm very familiar with that place, yeah.
A great club, and we played every Monday night, and it was a revolving group, but there were some core members. Lou Soloff was one of the key members, and Hiram was in the band. The early band was Adam Nussbaum, great Adam Nussbaum drummer, was playing in it, and it was probably the best experience of my life playing with Gil Evans, because it was the combination of everything, of all the different styles that I'd played, and in the presence of Gil Evans, who was the leader, and also with all the great players, the top players in New York. And so it was a really interesting, it was like a workshop type of thing, because it was very experimental. We played a lot of Gil's music, but a lot of his music at that time was more open, with playing the heads to different songs and then just improvising. And for any one song, you might have 5 or 6 soloists. So for a rhythm section player, bass player, or drummer, you really had to be creative and, you know, work with different backgrounds and follow the improviser and work with dynamics to make each solo dynamic, you know, because you can't just play at the same level all the time. It's just boring, and it doesn't do it. So we did a lot of experimentation, and later on, Gil wanted to change drummers just for a different flavor, and he brought Danny Gottlieb in. So then it was Danny and I with the Gil Evans Orchestra, and in the early years without him, we did Live at Sweet Basil. There's several volumes of that. There's a double record and another one that we did. But also during that time with Gil, we toured with Miles Davis. We opened up. Actually, Miles opened up because Miles wanted to go on first, and we would close sometimes, but we were on the same billing. So we did tours in Europe. We went to Japan with him. And, you know, to me, that was as close as, I always wanted to play with Miles, and I never did, but I felt close to Miles by being with Gil and, you know, being in the band, touring with them. And so it was a great experience, because Gil, he trusted all the players in the band, and he hired everyone for the color and the music that they brought to it. And he, as I said, they trusted us, and we had total freedom, but it was a sort of a voluntary, controlled freedom, because we were in the presence of Gil. So it was a really, really experience of a lifetime. And we later went on to Europe and played with Sting. We backed up Sting, a tour in Europe at Jazz Festival, and we also did a record with Sting. 2 records. One is Nothing Like the Sun. We played 2 tracks on that record, and we did a record called the Gil and Sting Sessions. I forget what it's called, but it was from the live gig that we did.
Yeah, Mark, I'm so impressed. I mean, like I said, you've played with everyone, and 2 of my favorite musicians that you played with, or guitarists rather, are John McLaughlin and the late Larry Coryell. I mean, what was it like working with McLaughlin? Because I mean, like I said, the first thing you think of is Mahavishnu Orchestra, and of course the stuff he did with Miles, and of course he's legendary. He's played with everyone himself. But what was it like working with McLaughlin?
Well, I played with him a few times. The first time was with Bill Evans, the saxophone player, on his record, and we recorded a song on that in the studio. And that was like a dream come true, because John was playing acoustic nylon string guitar on that, and I'm such an admirer, I still am, of John. He's one of my big inspirations in music, of everything that he's done. So to be in the studio with him and playing was such high energy, and I almost was outside my body, you know, watching the whole thing happen, even though I was very inside it. It was phenomenal. It was, again, one of those life experiences that I'll always remember, and I'm so glad that it was captured in a record. And then he sat in when I played with the CTI All-Stars at Montreux, and I was just sitting in, and we were playing a blues, I think. But been in touch over the years through various, I know Danny was with Mahavishnu Orchestra, so sometimes on tours that I was around, I would see John, and he's such an inspiration, like I said, one of the all-time great guitarists. And then playing with Larry Coryell, I was with a trio with Larry, with Paul Wertico for many years. And we traveled all over the world, and another innovator, jazz guitar innovator, modern jazz guitar. You know, Larry is one of the early electric jazz guitar players to really bring forward fusion music. And, you know, he played with John.
That's right.
You know, with the trio with Paco. And Larry was such a beautiful leader. He was so generous to us as players, you know, to play, and always trusted us, and just a great sense of humor, and a great player. And, you know, we would start out playing Bag's Groove, just get the feel of the room, and medium tempo blues, Bag's Groove. Yeah. And just take it from there. And we did originals and standards, and we had so much fun touring with Paul and Larry, and we played, as I mentioned, Europe several times, Japan, Brazil. So it was just a great experience, and I miss Larry so much. He was a dear friend.
Yeah, both of those guys are great. Now, I wanted to ask you, Mark, during this COVID, a lot of musicians, of course, can't tour. Are you doing anything as far as like teaching or offering any courses online or working with students?
You know, I've done a few just private lessons with people, not that much through Zoom. I've mostly been doing, I have a studio, so mostly at my studio I've been doing tracks. People send me tracks, and I've been recording for other people. So that's been keeping me busy. A lot of people are obviously in the same position, but they want to be creative and stay creative. So I've been, you know, a good solid wave of adding bass parts to different people's tracks. And they usually send me, let's say, a stereo file of the mix, or sometimes break it down to different stems, maybe the drums, whatever the instrument, guitar, and a mix. And then I'll put together my own mix and add my bass playing, and send them a high quality file back. And, you know, it is what it is. It's not the interactiveness of playing and responding to someone live, but having played so much in the studio and done so much recording over the years, I've been used to overdubbing and doing things. That's sort of what I do a lot. So in that way, I've kept in the groove of doing things, as well as I didn't mention yet, Danny Gottlieb and I have a new record that came out in September, which is called Electric Blue.
Okay.
And it's a duo record that's out, and during COVID, the whole time I mixed that, and I've been working on editing that, and producing it and putting it out. So that came out in September. It's actually still getting airplay and doing pretty well.
Fantastic. And
actually reached number 11 on the jam band charts, which is amazing because it's just drums and bass. And it's something that Danny and I always wanted to do, was just record just drums and bass, because we always had a very special rapport when we would get together just as a duo. And we always would do these complete pieces as improvisations, or it might start like as a little idea that we would expand on, whether it be a bass groove or a drum groove. And so Danny, we did that, and we put it together. And for the first time, actually it's on my label, which is called Wave Tone Records.
Yeah.
It's available everywhere on iTunes and Amazon and everywhere. But for the first time on my label, I have 25 releases on it.
That's incredible.
I've had it since 1993, and we've been mostly doing Elements records and my solo records. Did a Joe Beck, great guitarist.
Joe Beck, yeah.
Jeff Champa. And this one we put out not only as CD, which was necessary to send to radio stations because some radio stations still request CDs, but we also put it out as vinyl. So it was the first time producing a vinyl record in a long time, since our old RCA days with Elements and all the other records. So I learned a lot I relearned about producing for vinyl and how you have to master it in a certain way. And because it was such a wide dynamic record, because it was all just bass and drums, and the bass is really big in the mix. So at a certain point, when you're mastering for, for example, technically speaking, you have to, it's stereo, but you have to go down to mono at a certain frequency or else the needle will just jump off the track. So that was one thing that we learned about it. It was mastered by Phil Magnotti, great friend and great engineer and mastering engineer. So
Interesting.
yeah, so that's what I've been doing during the COVID. That and a lot of it was producing that duo record with Dan and I, and then doing other tracks, and then basically just writing music. And I found that it's a great creative period for me. I didn't want to just not do anything during this time, so I've been practicing and writing and composing and working on new music. So, it's tough for everybody though. You just can't be with your friends, other than a phone call or a Zoom or, from a distance. But I have to be very careful because my wife is very susceptible, her immune system. So
Yeah.
we're really isolated, completely isolated, basically. So we've been just watching it, and it's a strange time for everyone. I'm sure for you. How have you been making out with it?
Well, I'm very blessed, Mark. I mean, of course, I work from home, and I'm always out going to like a jazz show or a concert, and it's been crazy for me. I mean, it's just weird every weekend not being able to do anything or go anywhere. Sometimes you can get really bored. You can't read but so many books or watch but so many movies, and I'm so used to just being, it's like the jazz, the music. The live concerts are just my thing, and I really miss doing that. One question I wanted to ask you also, because like I said, I love the way that you play bass. I love your sound, the tone. I would love to hear Wayne Shorter compose something with your bass playing in it.
I would love to play something that Wayne Shorter wrote, with
Yeah.
that I could play in it. That would be an amazing thing. He's also one of my favorite players.
Oh,
And
great
I love his
composer.
compositions. As a composer, I really, really love everything that he's written from the very beginning. It's
Yeah.
it always gets to the center and is so unusual in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, his work with Art Blakey, of course, Miles and Weather Report. And it was interesting. They were interviewing Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinu, and they were asking them questions about their songs. And the guy says, "No, we don't write songs. We write sagas and epics." You know,
That's true.
and the music is just so incredible. But I'm curious also, whenever you do have a little bit of time, I know that you're always working on stuff, your own stuff, and you mentioned Danny, but what artists is Mark Egan listening to? I mean, sometimes if you have a little bit of time, you're just relaxing with your wife. What do you put on and listen to? I mean, something old, something new, any new artists that you're checking out? What are you listening to these days whenever you have time?
Lately I've been listening to, going back and listening to Scott LaFaro with Bill Evans Trio
Yeah.
at the Vanguard. I've been listening a lot to that. I've been listening a lot to Keith Jarrett.
Oh man, yeah, he can't play really anymore.
Yes, it's very sad. And his trio
Genius.
are always so great to listen to me. But, I have, like so many people, iTunes, and I, subscribe to it. So I just I drive around a lot as a means to just get out. So I have
Yeah.
a lot of things that are in play in the car. Um, Lately, I just actually, I'll show you this cover here. I just happen to have it. I didn't think of showing this, but there's a new record out. It's a big band,
Oh wow.
and that I did during COVID. It's a directed by Dan Bonsanti, and it's a group in Florida, but they use a lot of players, and Peter Erskine is on that. And that's speaking
I
of
had
weather.
Peter. I had Peter on the show too. Great drummer, really good guy. Yeah.
Yes, what an amazing musician. His feel. So that was an example of, they sent me the tracks for that, and Peter's track, and I got a stereo mix of Peter and played along with him, and I was just in awe of his feel. Just the groove of it was so.
Jaco, Mark Jaco felt that way about him too. That's why when he asked him to join, Weather Report, he liked Peter's playing because I think they were trying to get other players. And I had drummer Chester Thompson on, who used to be with them, and they were just telling me the story how they wanted Peter, and Jaco loved the way Peter played. You know.
Yes. So that's something I've been listening to lately, and then a lot of classical music. I've been playing some classical guitar. And so I've been listening to classical pieces, Carcassi, and working on that. That's something that I do daily. Nylon string guitar and steel string guitar a little bit. Just trying to, I like to play like bossa nova style guitar. So I'm just working on just some basic things just to take me outside of bass.
Yeah.
You know, because it's good to play another instrument to make it changes how you view your instrument that you play, you know, and I do play a little piano, so working on chords and harmony, and those are some of the things I've been working on and listening to.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Mark. Over the years, have you considered maybe picking up that trumpet again? Do you still dabble with it?
You know, Preston, I haven't. I have it, but I haven't played in a long time, and now because you know my embouchure is not.
Right.
I haven't played in a while, but I think like a trumpet player in a lot of ways in my improvisations, and just a lot of my melodic playing on bass is very influenced by trumpet playing, just my phrasing.
Yeah.
Because when you play a trumpet, you really have to articulate, you know, play a melody. You can't just play all staccato notes or all slurred. It's very expressive. It's like a voice. And I approach the bass the same way, that, you know, especially with melodies from doing, you know, playing with Pat Metheny is when I really got to really work on it and develop it. And then going and doing my own records, and, you know, when people ask me to play solos on different records, I really have to think about the articulation and really make it sound like I'm singing. You know, it really is, to me, it's a vocal approach to the instrument. So in that way, I still play the trumpet. And I actually I still have the fingering, you know, in my head when I'm playing notes, even though it's a transposed instrument.
And last question, Mark. If I were to ask you three pivotal recordings or three pivotal recordings that really stand out, that were influential in helping you develop, maybe you listen to those recordings still, could you pick three recordings that stand out that are very important in, you know, shaping your musical, you know, ideas and that whole thing?
Yeah, I would say early on, Jimi Hendrix' Electric Ladyland.
Oh, wow.
And Axis Bold as Love, those two. That was before I was really into the real depth of jazz. And then when I went to Miami, I first heard Kinda Blue, which is a pivotal record, a pivot point record for everyone, I think. But that one I wore out and still listen to. And after that, I would say probably Heavy Weather, Weather Report.
Oh, that's a masterpiece.
Was one that, you know, that pivotal records that really changed the field for me, because that's when Jaco really broke out. Even though I'd heard Jaco before, hearing him with Weather Report, and at the beginning when Jaco was with Weather Report, he wasn't affected. He was really Jaco. He stood on stage. I remember seeing the first tour they did.
Right.
And I said, yeah, whoa. And he just stood there and played. And then the next couple of tours, maybe a year later, I saw him, Jaco was dancing around stage. And I said, he sounded great if I closed my eyes, but the antics didn't make sense to me. It didn't, for some reason, it threw me off.
Yeah,
and then, you know, he was getting so much attention and, you know, throwing the bass up in the air. And I said, oh man, I really prefer the pure Jaco that I heard in the early years and early.
Right.
You know, but when you really listen to Jaco later, not to keep talking about Jaco, but there was genius all the time with him. You know, you can't hide genius, no matter how affected or how whatever condition you're in. It's there. Like Charlie Parker, even in his later years, he was brilliant. You know, there were brilliant bursts. You know, so it was always there. But so I would say those are the three records for me. You know.
Yeah. One that stands out for me is John Coltrane, "A Love Supreme."
You know,
that's you may have to put that as a fourth one, huh?
You know, interesting that you mentioned that, because right after I was into Kinda Blue with Miles, I remember listening to "A Love Supreme" with headphones on, and that's when I realized that people were communicating in a very sophisticated language, jazz.
Yeah.
That's when it really clicked for me. So I would say that would be 2 Plus, the Miles and Coltrane, because that was a very important record. I realized it. After that record, I said, this is it. I got it. I mean, I understand now where I have to go and what, because this is the communication. This is the deep communication.
Yeah.
Because when you hear all the instruments and how they're all correlating and Coltrane leading it. So
it's beautiful.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Mark, listen, I want to thank you so much for being on Jazz Talk. Man, you're a class act, you're one of my favorite musicians, and just a great guy. Hang on, I'm about to close out the show.
Okay.
Well, you've heard it from the great Mark Egan. And as the saying goes, if the music grooves and makes you move, it must be jazz. I'm Preston Williams with Jazz Talk signing off. Peace.
Thank you.